Welcome back to the channel, guys. In today's video we will look at some of the less known armored vehicles of World War II. Apart from using mostly German equipment in World War II, especially during the end of the war, the Hungarian government had some tank and tank destroyer developments of their own. Today we will take a look at some of them: the Toldi light tanks, the Turan medium tank, and the Zrínyi tank destroyer. Let's start with the lightest of them, which was also the first to put into service, the 38M Toldi. In the middle of the 1930s, the Hungarian government placed orders for a new light tank. For this request, the designers at the Manfred Weiss company developed a new tank called the Strasler V4, after its designer. Though this name is not familiar to most people, but I think you would recognize some of his work. Nicholas Strasler was a Hungarian-born engineer who became a British citizen in the 1930s, and he was the designer of the flotation system on the amphibious Sherman DD tanks. He also designed a bomb trolley for the RAF, which was widely used during World War II. Now, after this little detour, back to the history of the tanks. The Strasler V4 was developed in 1936 and tested in 1937, and initially was deemed acceptable and was meant to be put into service. It featured a 40mm gun and comparable armor to the other designs of the time, like the Panzer II. But changes in politics meant that Hungary started a rearming program following its allies, Italy and Germany, and because of that they opened up to purchase foreign weapons too. In 1938 the V4 was tested again, now against the Swedish Landsverk L60 and the German Panzer I tanks, and the test showed the Swedish design was the best. Though the V4 featured a 40mm gun against the weaker armament on its opponents, its design was less simple, and the Swedish light tank featured a more modern layout. It had sloped armor, torsion bar suspension, and it had room for improvements. This led to the cancellation of the V4 project and the purchase of the rights for the Swedish L60, which was then modified to the needs of the Hungarian army. The modifications on the design included changes to the turret to install a radio, and change in the main armament. The Toldi used the Hungarian 36M 20mm cannon as the main armament, which was a license-built version of the Solothurn S18 anti-tank rifle. There were proposals to use a 37 or 40mm gun, but since those would have required to fully redesign the turret, they were dismissed. The Toldi as a light tank and being a pre-war design was good enough at the beginning of the war, but its thin armor and small caliber main gun quickly became too weak as the tank development accelerated to immense speed during the war. It featured only 13mm of armor on the hull front and sides, and 6mm on the top and rear. The turret was similarly armored, with 13mm of armor thickness on the front and the sides, and 6mm on the back. Because of the very thin armor, the Toldi only weighted around 8.5 tons, so it was fairly mobile even though it only used a 160 horsepower petrol engine. It could reach a maximum speed of 50 km an hour and had a range of 220 km. The tank's main armament was the 20mm 36M gun. The secondary armament was one 8mm machine gun. On later models they tried to improve on the design. The Toldi 2A used the 40mm 42M gun and increased frontal armor. Around 80 units were converted to the new standards. The final version, the Toldi 3, featured even thicker armor with 35mm on the hull front and the gun mantlet, but only 12 of them were built near the end of the war. The Toldi tanks first saw combat in April 1941 in the invasion of Yugoslavia. Reliability was their biggest problem in this short operation, as many of them broke down. Later 81 of them participated in Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Though at first they managed to find some success by meeting the pre-war T-26 and BT tanks, which featured similar light armor and armament, when meeting the modern T-34 and KV tanks, the Toldi's main gun and thin armor proved worthless. The tank's 13mm armor was no match even to the Soviet anti-tank rifles. Their losses began to mount, but most of them were declared lost because of mechanical issues, not because of enemy fire. While some 25 were lost to enemy fire, more than 60 simply broke down. By 1942, the Toldi tanks were relegated to reconnaissance, command, or even ambulance roles. Despite their shortcomings, the Toldis were used until the end of the war. In 1944 there were still more than 120 of them operational, but almost all of them were destroyed in the last months of the war, as they had no hope to compete against the modern Soviet tanks. The Toldi as a light tank was not a bad one, as its base, the original Swedish version, was used for years after the end of World War II, but in the struggle against the Soviet forces, it was not the weapon that was needed. The Hungarian army was in need of something heavier. And with that we arrived to its bigger brother, the 40M Turan medium tank. In 1940, negotiations started between the Skoda company and the Hungarian government about military equipment, and the Hungarian delegation was presented with the T-21 and the LTVZ-35 tank designs. They were impressed by them, and negotiations started about purchasing the manufacturing rights to the T-21. The deal was soon concluded, and the parties agreed that they will share information with each other on future developments. The Hungarians most importantly changed the turret on the tank design, swapping the original 2-man turret for a bigger 3-man one, so similarly to the German tanks, they used a 5-man crew. The original 47mm main gun was also changed to a Hungarian-made 40mm one, as they found the two guns had similar penetration values. This was the same gun used on the late model upgraded version of the Toldi light tank. The gun was considered a good design at the beginning of the war. Its performance was just a bit below the Panzer III's 50mm gun. I have already made a video about the history of the Panzer III, so if you're interested in that, I recommend you watch it. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. Now let's get back to the history of the Turan tank. The tank's original engine was also changed for a Hungarian-made V8, and the armor thickness was increased to 50mm. Though the deal to purchase the license was done quickly, the manufacturing ran into delays. The manufacturing of thick armor plates was problematic at the time in Hungary, and even after they finished the prototypes and testing started in July 1941, lots of problems were found. Engine problems delayed the testing for months. Later the cooling system proved to be too weak, the piping was prone to cracking and clogging up, and the drivers had trouble using the double clutch on the transmission. Finally in spring 1942, all the faults were fixed, and the updated Turans were delivered to the training units, but this was about a year later than planned. Already during development it became clear that the main armament needs to be improved, as the 40mm gun only had a penetration of around 46mm at 100 meters distance, and this fell to just 30mm at 1000 meters. In 1941 during Operation Barbarossa, these guns proved to be incapable of penetrating the new Soviet tanks, like the T-34 or the KV-1. To keep up with the newly arriving Soviet tanks, work started to mount a 75mm gun on the Turan. The plan was to fit a modified version of the already available 18M field gun. But to fit this larger gun, a completely new turret design was needed. The work on the modified new gun and the new turret was finished early 1942, so basically both the 40mm equipped Turan 1 and the 75mm equipped Turan 2 versions finished development at the same time. But the Turan 2s actually only entered service in September 1943, as the production of the gun, optics and ammunition again was delayed. It's worth mentioning that in Hungary the Turan 2 was classified as a heavy tank because they used gun caliber rather than actual weight to class the vehicles. The Turan was a bigger and heavier tank than the small Toldi, and it was more armored. It featured 50mm of armor on the hull front and 25mm on the sides. The turret was similarly armored, with again 50mm thick armor on the front and 25mm on the sides and the rear. Its armament consisted of a 40mm gun on the Turan 1 models and a short 75mm gun on the Turan 2 models. For secondary armament it featured two 8mm machine guns. The tank was powered by a 14.8-liter petrol V8 engine, producing 260 horsepower, which allowed it to reach 47 km an hour maximum speed and a range of 165 km. The Turan tanks saw action the first time in April 1944. Their first engagement went surprisingly well, as they managed to knock out a few T-34s. But even though it was a good medium tank design in 1940, by the time it saw action, it was considered obsolete. The original 40mm gun was completely useless against the Soviet T-34s. While the Turan 2's short-barreled 75mm gun could knock out T-34s at around 600 meters, but they were vulnerable to the T-34's gun at much greater ranges. Especially considering at that time they faced the T-34-85 models, which could easily knock out a Turan from 1000 meters. It's no surprise these tanks suffered heavy losses on the Eastern Front against the more numerous and better Soviet tanks. Some of the Turans fought on until the end of the war, but most of them were destroyed. If not by the Soviet guns, then by their own crews. The Turan medium tank was not a bad design, comparable to the early German tanks, but Hungary was lacking the industrial power to keep developing them, and because of the years of delays in their development, by the time they got into combat, they were basically obsolete. There were some other upgrades and versions planned for these tanks. By 1943, a program was started to mount a long 75mm gun on the Turan, which was a Hungarian-made version of the German Pak-40 anti-tank gun. With the new gun, an actual working prototype was built, which also featured 75 to 90mm frontal armor, and even went through trials. But this variant didn't went into production, because Germany occupied Hungary in March 1944, and they restricted further tank production. Another interesting version of the Turan tank was a tank destroyer built on the Turan chassis, and this will be our last topic today, the Zrínyi assault gun. The Hungarian army was missing an infantry support vehicle with a bigger gun than the 20 and 40mm ones on the Toldi and Turan tanks, and they needed one badly. As in many countries, designers in Hungary were also inspired by the German assault gun, the Stug, but they failed to purchase those from the Germans. In June 1942, a study was made on creating separate assault gun units in the Hungarian army. As a result, a proposal was sent to the Manfred West Company to develop an assault gun on the basis of the new Turan medium tank, equipped with a modified version of the already available 105mm 40M howitzer. The plans for the new vehicle were quickly drawn up, but then the project ran into problems with the bureaucracy. Since the assault guns were developed under the Department of Artillery, they didn't think it's necessary to notify the tank forces about it. The Inspector General of the tank forces was furious and denied the allocation of armor production and training time for the assault guns, as he argued both were needed for the tanks and tank crews. After some struggle, the steel was allocated for manufacturing, but the artillerymen still had to set up their own training facilities for the assault guns. The work on the first prototype started in December 1942. The chassis of the Turan tank was widened by 450mm, the turret was removed, and a more heavily armored superstructure built on top. Not long after the first prototypes were finished, the Ministry of Defense received reports showing doubts that the new assault guns wouldn't be able to fight the new T-34 tanks with their 105mm howitzers. To correct this, a project was started to install the higher velocity 75mm 43M anti-tank gun on the Zrínyi chassis. This gun could penetrate 76mm of angled armor from 600 meters. Hoping to have this variant as the bulk of the assault guns, they named the 75mm variant Zrínyi 1 and renamed the original version to Zrínyi 2. But the development and modification of the new gun was very slow, so the prototype 75mm version was only completed a year later, in February 1944. Even after that, problems were found on the new 75mm gun, so the production was further postponed to August 1944. But by that time production couldn't start thanks to the Allied bombing raids. No more 75mm Zrinyis were built apart from the single prototype, and only the Zrínyi 2 was kept in production and was used until the end of the war. The Zrínyi assault gun was heavier than the original Turan it was based on. Though the turret was removed, the bigger gun, wider chassis, and thicker frontal armor all added weight, so it ended up weighing almost 22 tons. It featured 75mm armor on the front and 25mm on the sides, while the top was 13mm thick. Later additional 5mm side skirts were added. The main armament was the 105mm 40M howitzer, which could fire high explosive, heat or smoke grenades. The 105mm heat was effective against the Soviet T-34s, but it was hard to aim because of the low velocity of the gun. The vehicle used the same V8 engine, developing 260 horsepower as the Turan tanks, and could reach a maximum speed of 43 km an hour. It had a bigger fuel capacity, so its effective range was 280 km. Similarly to the Turan tanks, the Zrínyi assault guns first saw action in April 1944, and their first combat actions also went fairly well. They fared well against the Soviet infantry. After all, this was their original purpose. In their first combat against Soviet armor, they managed to knock out some T-34s, forcing the rest to withdraw. But by the end of the summer, the Axis forces were on the retreat on the Eastern Front, and the Zrínyi battalion suffered heavy losses too, especially as many times they were used as a rearguard to cover the retreating troops. Their biggest combat victory came in September the same year, when 6 of them set up an ambush and caught a Soviet tank brigade in crossfire. They only opened fire at very close ranges, and in about 4-5 minutes managed to knock out 18 T-34s. The Zrínyi assault gun was in use until the end of the war, though their numbers were reduced day by day with every skirmish, as the Soviet forces pushed the Axis back. The last few of them still participated in the siege of Budapest against the Red Army, and the last of them were abandoned in February 1945. The only surviving Zrínyi is on display today at the Kubinka Tank Museum. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.